Hello everyone, it has been a crazy week for the Civilization franchise. Not only did we get a 20-minute gameplay trailer, but some massive changes were revealed, like civ swapping, map verticality, navigable rivers, and much more. With this video, I hope to provide an in-depth breakdown of the gameplay we've seen so far, but I also wanted to discuss some community reactions because quite frankly, they've been far more negative than I was initially expecting. As someone that grew up on Civ 4 and eventually transitioned to Civ 6, I will try to remain as unbiased as possible, but also offer a tiny bit of my perspective to round things off. There's also a lot of gameplay and BS to comb through, so hopefully I save you some time. Now, I do not receive early access to these trailers, which is why my videos are out days later, but one of the advantages of writing a script after things drop is being able to gauge initial reactions. In addition to being a Civ fan, I'm also a Star Wars fan, and I think I have a fairly good understanding of how volatile a community can be. However, I've seen surprisingly negative posts even on r/civ, which is almost like seeing brisket at a PETA convention. Of course, there is bound to be criticism when you reveal new mechanics, but one of the new changes I've seen criticized is the new Ages system. Civ 6 had a whopping 8 eras, spanning from the Ancient to Information, with another era added in Gathering Storm. In a series first, Civ 7 will have 3 ages: Antiquity, Discovery, and Modern. Personally, my biggest gripe with eras in Civ 6 was that there were too many and they went by too quickly. Because of how techs and civics were balanced, the penalties for leaping ahead with science were easier to ignore. In Civ 7, it looks like you won't be able to rush from era to era in nearly the same way, because technologies are locked behind each age. I feel like 3 ages is the opposite extreme of what we had in Civ 6, but we are still seeing the same return with civics and technologies being in separate trees. Instead, some seem to be confused on where exactly these ages end and begin. As I understand it, Antiquity covers the Neolithic to the fall of Rome, Discovery ends at industrialization, and Modern is up until this point in history right now. With the new tech tree, you can double back and research a technology again to obtain a mastery. Instead of tech rushing, scientifically advanced civs will have deeper understandings of technologies compared to their rivals. We've seen cultures like Egypt with their own mini-trees related to their culture, and I hope this means more customization options. The potential reason behind why there are less ages may have to do more with the nations themselves. In a series first, as you change ages, you will also change civs. We may have had leaders that could change between a set of civilizations, but this is a new precedent altogether. Humankind tried a very similar approach with its culture system, where you would swap out cultures as the eras advanced, and it was a deeply unpopular feature. One of the major reasons for this was because people felt a lack of connection to the countries they were building. You may have a unique setup going from the Babylonians to the Maya, but by the end of the game, the map looks like a chaotic mishmash of different cultures after swapping so many times. I wanted to quote Ed Beach, the lead developer, directly on this. When moving from antiquity to exploration, and later exploration to modern, you select a new civilization to lead. You'll retain all the cities you controlled before, but have access to different technologies and attributes. This may seem strange, but it's built to reflect history. Think of London, which was once run by the Romans before being supplanted by the Anglo-Saxons. No empire lasts forever, but they don't all collapse either. The issue here seems to be the attempt to base things on a historical angle, which I feel doesn't really hold up. A lot of the fun of Civilization for me comes from doing wacky things, like leading the US from the Stone Age and fighting the Romans with nuclear weapons. The franchise has been a sandbox first and foremost, with historical elements being added on later. Sure, you can't conjure magic or ride zebras into battle, but I think there is a very fine line of historical fiction that Civilization balances on that allows us to become more immersed with our creations. I can't really lead Egypt to the modern era if I am forced to switch cultures. I might still have my pyramids, but now we're running into the same issues that humankind faced with building a connection. I wanted to include something someone pointed out, and I thought it was morbidly ironic. If you're trying to play as a culture like the Maori, you might have to switch to a colonizer to advance to the next era. This mechanic might be slightly more historically accurate, but I've seen many disappointed reactions, and I can't help but to agree. It seems like all roads lead back to humankind. Am I really Egyptian if my new cities as England are being called York and Manchester? Did I even continue the game, or was I defeated and I'm now playing as my conquerors? Where is the leeway for roleplay and immersion? Wasn't the original slogan, "Can your civilization stand the test of time?" To further complicate things, when you want to go to the next age, you only have a select number of cultures to choose from. How historical is going from Egypt to Mongolia, for example? With a limited number of ages, and now having to choose who to evolve into, it makes it harder to slot in certain cultures. So how do you choose where to put an older culture that has existed from antiquity to discovery? That's a large period of history, and not everyone fits neatly into those huge time spans. The Franks definitely wouldn't fit into discovery, but would they really make sense in antiquity? I mean, what on earth is a Buganda? We may have more historical options to choose from, like the Egyptians going to the Abbassids instead, but that still gets us back to the main point. We want to play as the same culture, not advance to another one. To play devil's advocate, out of the 4 cultures we've seen thus far, all of them have had multiple unique improvements, buildings, and units. It surprises me that there isn't more discussion around this, because this is a fairly significant change. New cultures have more tools to play around with, and this may be a big boost to Restartitis. If one unique building doesn't fit the current map, then you can always try out the second option in the meantime. I'm fairly hyped about this change, but let me know what you think more in the comments down below. Crises exist to ensure that you actually transition into the next phase of the game. I'm quoting The Guardian on this, and it reads, "Breaking Civilization 7 into chapters also gives campaigns a new rhythm. As you approach the end of an age, you'll begin to face global crises. In Antiquity, for instance, you can see the proliferation of independent powers similar to the tribes that tore down Rome. We're not calling them barbarians anymore," Beach says. "It's a more nuanced way to present them. These crises multiply and strengthen until you reach the next age. It's like a sci-fi or fantasy Stellaris series with a huge, crazy conclusion, and then the next book starts nice and calm," Beach says. "There's a point when getting to the next age is a relief." Strategy games in general always face the issues of late-game stagnation. Once you become powerful enough, there is little point in going forward. To counteract this, it looks like the game is trying to push players to become more involved with the map earlier on. In Civ 6, the World Congress had emergencies that you could participate in, but they often resulted in very little actually changing due to a lack of ways to directly and indirectly participate. Again, it does have some historical basis, but this is a very fragile tightrope. If you make these crises too strong, players will become increasingly frustrated by their lack of control. On the other hand, if they are too weak, the players end up having very little reason to be interested, and we are back in the same situation like with Civ 6. I like that we will have challenges to eventually face, but there will need to be a significant balancing for higher difficulties depending on how they design this system. From the feedback we've received, the reactions have not been the most positive, I would say. My understanding of the crisis is that you start getting pop-ups at the end of the age, and you become forced to choose from a selection of detrimental policy cards. This sounds very reminiscent of Dark Ages from Civ 6, and their policy cards were completely optional. The growing trend seems to be to focus on making your empire adapt to change, but even if you're playing the game optimally, you're still being punished, it seems. Another angle we should consider is balancing abilities. In Civ 5, for example, Venice could only found one city, and in Civ 6, Coupe starts out in the ocean. How do you create unique and challenging abilities while having to switch cultures 2 times each game? I can see some of the more impactful abilities being locked behind leaders, but it still seems like an unnecessary addendum. We now pick leaders separately from cultures with this game, but that also gets back into questioning historical authenticity. I also want to quickly correct the devs where they said that this was the first time that you could pick leaders separately in Civilization, but you could do this in the options menu for Civ 4. On a more positive note, I really like how the map has changed with Civ 7. One of humankind's biggest achievements was their verticality. No longer were maps completely flat, with cities being able to interact more with their environment. Natural disasters are returning from Gathering Storm as well, and leaders being able to pick what civilizations they want to lead may add even more replayability into the mix. If there was anything I wanted to see return from humankind though, it was city sprawl. Civ 6 had its fair share of criticism because of how spread out cities were. Hell, my last video was discussing a mod that addressed that issue exactly. But due to the new system, a district could be several tiles away from the city's center, making it feel discombobulated and chaotic. In Civ 7, builders have been gutted entirely, and cities now directly improve resources without having to worry about build charges. In fact, there is a lot that is being inspired by humankind here. We've already talked about culture swapping, but even the cities look very similar. One thing that is staying the same is hexes and settlers, but we now have a hard settlement cap which I've seen quite a few negative reactions to. I will applaud them for finally adding navigable rivers, though I hope that they would be wider in-game. This was a hugely requested feature, and it changes naval gameplay up dramatically. Now that units can sail down rivers, there is a lot to be said for focusing more on coastal cities. An issue that is eternally present in Civ discussions is how to balance naval gameplay, so I hope this is a more positive addition for maritime civilizations. This means you can historically rate upriver as the Norse, assuming they are in the game. I've seen many positive reactions to the changes that Civ 7 is bringing to combat. Instead of retaining the old 1 unit per tile system, units stack into an army as is represented by a single unit on the map, and when they enter a battle, they spread out over the map. You can still technically have 1 unit per tile, but it seems much more efficient to have units gather around the commander, which is better for combat. But this is also straight up from Humankind, and it's astounding how much has been borrowed from that game. Granted, Humankind's combat system was one of my favorites so far out of all of the 4X games I've played. I think the new terrain system allows warfare to be more dynamic, instead of a massive units butting against each other on the map. This also makes it easier for players to keep track of units, only needing to individually move them when wars are happening, with less micromanagement. The big departure from humankind's combat system comes with commanders, who use a skill tree and promotions to increase their prowess. Instead of individually upgrading units in the old games, everything has been streamlined. I'm really happy with this change, and I haven't seen any significant criticism of it from the reviewers. When it comes to optimization, Firaxis hasn't been consistent, so I am praying that these upgrades reduce turn time as well. One last important detail is how commanders place on the map. They appear to be an evolution of great generals, but now they have health, and keeping them alive is crucial to winning battles. Your front is going to collapse quickly later in the game if you're not giving adjacent units combat bonuses. Speaking of consistency, in the lead up to Civ 7, Firaxis announced that it was abandoning its launcher. This was a huge cause for celebration, because many in the community did not like how unnecessary it was. There were also concerns about data privacy, which I won't get into, but hilariously, they decided to do something equally problematic. If you go to the Steam page and scroll down far enough, you'll see that Civ 7 has some serious multiplayer restrictions. This could change before release, but only 5 players can start out in Antiquity, with more being added as the map expands with each age. This makes sense because of how many cultures there are, but there have been some prevailing theories that the change is due to Firaxis making concessions for a Switch release. By paring down certain features, it may be enough to port the game to Nintendo's console like they did with the last game. I own a Switch, and there is probably some credence to this theory. The hardware is nearly 8 years old, and it struggles to run games undocked at times. This criticism really extends to the leader models as well. I've seen more memes than I can count mocking Caesar's head model, and it is quite a striking departure from Civ 5's ambient leader screens. A lot of the interactions between leaders seemed very reminiscent of how humankind's avatars would act towards each other, with stark actions like war declarations seeing the avatars becoming more animated. This may be surprising coming from me, but with the release date being more than 180 days away, I think the UI will drastically improve. I'm not as sure about the leaders, as the new Frontier Pass was prone to reusing leader animations, and some of the latest DLC for Civ 6 had downright horrendous models, but I digress. I think, given enough time, the UI will improve for the better, and I will wait with bated breath until February. Another aspect that I pray is more fleshed out come February are victory conditions. The playtesters only made it through Antiquity, but the victory conditions seem to be less flexible than in prior games. As an example, the new economic victory is when you acquire 25 resources in your capital. It seems fairly straightforward, but you have to choose a specific path to work towards at the beginning of the game. As you progress, you'll receive new objectives, and this is something that you are pursuing the entire game. By filling up the meter, you slowly acquire legacy points that come with their own unique bonuses. On one hand, I've never been someone to choose a victory path until the very last 2 eras, so being forced into picking a path doesn't sit well with me. On the other hand, these victory conditions look to be far more interactive with the individual leader and culture traits, so I hope this helps to make the overall experience more immersive. I'm split 50-50 on this, so let me know what you think. This all ties into your leader attributes, which we've seen a small sneak peek of through the first impressions videos. The policy cards of Civ 6 have been replaced entirely, and now, just like the commander system, involve using acquired points to get new bonuses. Of course, the spiffing Brit built an incredibly overtuned Civ during the playtest, so I hope we will see some more serious consideration for balance before release. But I also want there to be more incentive to diverge and pick traits from paths that you may not normally choose for your victory type. Policy cards allowed you to freely swap out abilities, making for a more chaotic but exciting experience. With a tree for leader traits, I fear this system becoming too linear before we can really see what it can do. Empires are also seeing some nerfs to playing wide. There is now a settlement cap that can be increased as the game progresses. Population hubs are split up into settlements, towns, and cities. The happiness mechanic from Civ 5 seems to be returning in a similar form, where you gather luxuries to increase happiness and get a celebration. Once you have a celebration day, you can choose a specific bonus from a narrative event that has powerful rewards. Cities can still use adjacency bonuses since they are folded into the game, but districts seem to be much less of a thing from the gameplay footage that I've observed. Another big change is the removal of the pop system. Cities expand through population growth now, and you cannot swap workers to work certain tiles. What might upset people the most is getting rid of chops, which basically means that the Wonder Rush meta is very different in this game. Gathering Storm's drought system was in part a response to this, but removing it altogether indicates that they are taking a very different approach with newer systems like the leader attributes that I mentioned earlier. These are some of the biggest changes coming to Civ 7, but for the next part of the video, with respect to your time, I'll be going over some of the smaller changes. Diplomacy now has an influence resource that is correlated to it, which is increasingly similar to humankind, down to the naming. With influence, you have access to an expanded level of diplomatic interactions. If you want to learn more about the capital and send a friendly greeting, you have to now send 20 influence. It's the same if you want to be more aggressive and tell them to back off. Otherwise, you can choose a neutral greeting that doesn't have any big effects aside from establishing contact. I think people might be very pissed off if this stops them from being able to take action during crises, or another important event where timing is key. There seems to be a lot more micromanagement in this game, and I really hope it is more forgiving. Getting back to humankind, I mean influence, it interacts with independent people, which is similar to humankind. There are small differences, of course, like how you can spend your influence, but you are more or less doing the same thing. Your empire can either choose to use their influence to slowly win them over, or maybe even turn them into a city given enough time. We haven't seen all there is to this faction, so maybe it is more different than the aforementioned Civ Killer, but we'll see on release. Events, similar to Civ 4, are an older mechanic that is returning. Events are pretty commonplace across most strategy games, but it was an omission in Civ 6 and they were semi-present in Civ 5 from my memory. They have more of an impact in this game, with certain decisions having effects on how your government operates. I.e., do you take more authoritarian actions which makes your government steer towards a dictatorship, and so on and so forth. I've harped on about this enough, but we really need to have a discussion about plagiarism as a community. I know this is funny coming from someone who basically makes commentary videos on YouTube, but where do we draw the line between inspiration and straight up copying? I'm fine and even happy with some of the changes coming to cities, combat, and even diplomacy depending on how things develop, but the culture switching is a bit on the nose, don't you think? I mean, looking side by side at some of these screenshots, it really is jarring. Influence isn't the only pricey new mechanic. Thankfully, I'm based in North America because a lot of the discourse surrounding pricing is concerning. Paradox is also guilty of this, but the prices for Civ 7 in Australia, for example, are shocking. This is beginning to get into the hundreds of dollars for some players, and to make matters worse, Firaxis is already talking about DLC post-release, with a Founders Edition and Early Access included. Inevitably, culture switching is going to make or break this game, I believe, and I know it shocked a lot of players on debut. It depends on whether they decide to let you keep the same culture instead of changing it, but we really won't know until release. One of the causes people play Civ, me included, is to build a relationship with your creations, but this is knocking out a foundational pillar entirely. Just like the Ouroboros swallows its tail ad nauseum, I've seen this very common argument regurgitated on Civ forums. This is simply what happens with change in the Civ franchise, but I really couldn't disagree more. Changes from Civ 4 to 5, like squares to hexagons and stacking units to 1 per tile, are minuscule compared to swapping out cultures with each age. It is perfectly fine to be wary of change when it's affecting the core reason for why you're playing the game in the first place. Players can recognize the same franchise from game to game, but will they recognize Civ 7? Only time will tell. But that's going to be it for today's video. I hope this helped you get a better understanding of some of the bigger changes coming to the game and allows you to make a better informed decision on your purchase. The 20-minute gameplay trailer they released was not nearly as detailed as some of the breakdowns, and discourse is suffering accordingly. I'm going to remain cautiously optimistic as we inch closer and closer to release, so let me know whether or not you're hyped, and if you'd like to see more Civ 7 coverage from me. Also let me know if you enjoyed the video itself, because I take feedback to heart and I really appreciate your comments. I try to read as many as I can. Thank you guys so much for watching. Love you guys. Peace.